Urban Squeeze.
Another weekly look at the world of urban planning and some of the things that urban planners wrestle with when they think of how our cities should be built. Today we're talking about equality, or perhaps inequality, in the city. What does that mean?
We built this city. We built this city on rock and roll. Built this city. We built this city on rock and roll.
Dr. Tony Matthews, Dr. Natalie Osborne, I think if you built a city on rock and roll, it'd be equal, wouldn't it?
Well, let's hope so anyway.
It'd be a starting
Everybody
point.
likes to rock, right?
Everybody likes to rock and roll. Perhaps if you're in an earthquake-affected area, it may not be the most appropriate foundation, but I'm liking that as a starting point. What do you mean by this idea of equality or otherwise in the city? How do you approach it as an urban planner?
Well, the first thing to do, Matt, is look at cities as something that goes beyond the physical. So it's very easy to look at cities as a collection of buildings and infrastructure and space and things like that and see it purely as a physical product. And the reality is that cities are actually places for people, and their form and their function is really shaped by the actions, experiences and opportunities that different people have. And when we talk about equality or inequality in cities, and we tend to talk about inequality in cities a lot more, I think Natalie would agree with that, but the more or less of those actions and experiences and opportunities and the access to those things that you have, the more or less of that you have, the more or less equal your urban experience can tend to be. And so we start to see divisions occurring between groups across economic or cultural or social lines, and these divisions in turn preference certain groups over others, giving them better or worse access to urban fundamentals, and those are things like housing and employment opportunities and transport. So it's across those lines and others that equality or inequality tends to manifest itself in cities.
Can we talk in specifics about types of inequality? I mean, the obvious one is that, some people have more money than others, so they live in more significant housing or more valuable housing. But what are some of the other elements that we need to consider here specifically?
Well, I think it goes beyond the actual individual house. What we can actually see in Australian suburbs is our suburbs are actually quite segregated by class. So we have suburbs that, we consider to be wealthy suburbs or quite well-to-do suburbs, whereas suburbs that we might think of as lower socioeconomic or disadvantaged in some way. And your suburb, the suburb that you can afford to live in, shapes your ability to access a whole host of different services. It shapes your ability to access work, to access good schools for your kids, community infrastructure and services, your ability to access green space. And so this question about access really starts with something like, where can I afford to live? But these services and infrastructures are not distributed equally throughout the city. So it really has a roll-on effect. And I think, one really classic example is how public transport infrastructure and also active transport infrastructure like segregated bike lanes tend to be concentrated in wealthier areas where arguably these are people who perhaps don't need to rely on those services quite so much.
Perhaps or want to, perhaps, too.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas in poorer areas, they tend to be less serviced by public transport, to have less access to active transport infrastructure. And so they wind up having to pay more to get around and are dependent and spend more time in their cars, which then obviously has lots of other flow-on effects for them.
It's interesting on the Gold Coast, if we can draw on the local experience here too. I mean, it is a very immature public transport network here. Things are changing. We're seeing the development of the light rail, and that'll continue to evolve and roll out in years to come, we certainly hope. But certainly in terms of economic privilege and otherwise, there's not such a delineation, at least in a public transport sense, between who gets what depending on their wealth.
Well, we were looking specifically at the Gold Coast and trying to come up with some sort of a question of how it functions in terms of its equality or inequality, Matt. And one of the things that we observe about the Gold Coast that Natalie and I noticed and discussed before the show is that the Gold Coast has very good access to public space. So things like the beach and the hinterland and so forth. There's excellent access to those public spaces. They're open to everybody and they're free. So that's wonderfully inclusive. But where the inequalities occur then is in the transport access. Or the access to transport to get to these places. So, I mean, you mentioned the light rail, for example. We still only have stage 1, stage 2 coming online. And that's going to be great when it finishes off. But getting around the Gold Coast is nearly impossible in any joined-up sense right now without a car. So the Gold Coast is very car-dependent, which means that there's a lot of inequality. And fundamentally what it means is that if you don't have a car on the Gold Coast, you basically don't have a life there, because it's very, very hard to access and interact with the city itself. Some of the other things that we noticed about the Gold Coast is that a lot of the housing that is closer to amenities, particularly on the beach side of things, so the housing that's closer to the beach and closer to the strip there and the shops and the retail and the social life that goes with it, a lot of that's not really that family friendly. There's a lot of high-rise apartments, fairly limited provision of standard suburban houses with gardens and things like that people with children tend to favour, as we've heard on the show before. So there are good and bad aspects of the Gold Coast in terms of its equality-inequality ratio. And as you say, it is a new city, so it's still finding its feet, so to speak. But, there's pluses and minuses, definitely.
Accessibility to public space is obviously, things are more accessible if you live on the coastal strip, the edge, if you like, the Gold Coast Highway and surrounds. But in terms of difficulty, I presume you're talking about western suburbs, the hinterland specifically.
Yeah, I mean, if you're living in the hinterland, if you're living west of the M1, you're not getting near the beach or any of the coastal strip without a car, basically, at least not right now. There will eventually be the opportunity when the second phase of the light rail is complete. There'll be the opportunity to hop on there at Helensvale. But even that still requires you to get to Helensvale. And if you live in Tamborine, that's a fair distance and it's really only manageable by car. So some of these problems will unfortunately persist, but that's... I don't say that in terms of an explicit criticism. These kinds of problems happen in cities all over the world. It's how we resolve them really is the test of how we're doing.
What's the measure of equality in a city? Is there a scale?
Unfortunately not. I think most cities do some aspects of equality really well and most not so well. I mean, there are cities around the world that have... very good, very equitable access to good quality housing stock, whereas we know that in many Australian cities we're really struggling with housing affordability issues and people being excluded from rental markets. So there's so many factors that go into it, and I think really when we're talking about equality in cities, we're talking about a whole set of social and spatial and political relationships, and they're always shaped by that local context and by the sort of contours of our daily lives in the specific places where we live. So there's nothing quite so handy as a universal rating system that we can use, I don't think.
Well, it's interesting. I think of cities that have a significant amount of high-rise development. Obviously, a high-rise environment, like perhaps, can I say, Singapore, for instance, brings everyone closer together. The map or the footprint of the city is smaller, so access is a little bit easier around the place. But we don't necessarily want high-rise developments here, for good or for bad, I should say, in Australia. So you kind of get the equality you want, don't you?
In a sense, I mean, if you look at, I mean, and Natalie flagged the household or housing affordability, which is probably the biggest driver of inequality in this country right now, or certainly one of the principal ones. If you look at something like that, a lot of the housing, so we keep hearing this classic argument, particularly from government, that the housing affordability problem is a question of supply. If we supply more housing to the market, then it will make prices more reasonable, it will moderate them. And then you look at the type of supply that's coming to market and it's almost all high-rise. And we don't have a cultural history in this country of living in high-rise developments the way that cities or countries in places like Southeast Asia or Europe might do. So people tend to resist these. So it's almost like there's a narrative there that says, well, we recognise there's a housing affordability problem and here's our solution, but actually our solution is just going to further increase inequality. but that's not really part of it because that's not factored into the dollar price. So there's a sort of a missing link in logic there.
Yeah, and I think going back to Tony's point about how we don't have this kind of cultural memory or cultural expectation of living in high-rise, I think some of that's because some of the early high-rises that were built were just really terrible from a design standpoint, right? They didn't have really great kind of common use facilities. They weren't really built for people to raise families in, even though we see that people raise families in high density situations all over the world. But we don't have much experience with the kind of design that can make that work for people. And so people tend to think of living in an apartment as maybe a stage in your life, maybe before you get married, before you have kids, when it can actually be a lot more than that, but only if we're creating buildings that work for people. And unfortunately, with the kind of stock we're seeing come online at the moment, that's not really what's happening.
Well, interestingly enough, I saw splattered all over the front of the local paper this morning a few sketches of a new development for here on the Gold Coast, on the coastal strip. Essentially, it's got all sorts of yoga studios in it and lifestyle options and all sorts of goodies like that. So perhaps it's the beginning of a movement. You never know.
Maybe. The question I asked then, Matt, is where's the local school?
Yeah, well, this is a very good point too. Among other things, I'll just raise it as a something on point that I noticed this morning.
And that's a really good point that Natalie has raised, because we're seeing that happen in cities all over the country where there's a lot of density going into existing suburbs. In many cases, they're inner suburbs, they're close to CBDs, and the provision of school places isn't following. So you have a lot of families moving into these areas because they can't afford a conventional suburban detached house, so they move into an area, into an apartment for a few years, and then there's either not there aren't enough school places, or the schools that are in the area are not necessarily of the highest standard. I mean, one in particular that occurs in Brisbane, or that we see a problem with in Brisbane, is West End, where you have Brisbane State High, which is a great school, and there's been a lot of density has been put into West End in Brisbane, and so a lot of families have moved in there to get into the right catchment zone for the school, and the school is totally overburdened now and is being swamped with students, and so that's a bad outcome as well. I was just looking at some figures this morning about where this country sits in terms of its inequality, and I know we don't have a set type of measurement. There's different metrics and methodologies are used, but according to the OECD, who are an international organisation, Australia is in the top third of most unequal countries amongst its 34-country membership. And given that most of us, 90% of us in fact, live in cities, that means that we have very unequal cities.
Do people, as a general rule, and I appreciate this could get into a political discussion and certainly a philosophical political discussion at that perhaps, but can you earn the right to have more equality in a city if you work hard? You work hard to be educated. You work hard to get yourself a tertiary education, to become a doctor so you can afford a certain lifestyle. Is there something to be said for an ability in an economy to pay for more equality?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, that is definitely a philosophical debate, but I mean, I suppose my take on that, and I do a bit of work with a group called Right to the City Brisbane.
This is what I was getting at, in a sense.
Yeah.
Should everyone have equal access to infrastructure in a city, or does the very nature of our economy, in a sense, discourage that?
I think the very nature of our economy absolutely does discourage that. I think inequality is actually built into the way that we plan and develop our cities and the way that we provide infrastructure and services, but I don't think it should be. And so this is the question that people all around the world actually are taking up, broadly badged as kind of right to the city movements that are called different things in different places, but we see them in everywhere from Barcelona to Brazil to New York to Ecuador to Brisbane. People are talking about how actually our right to the city, our right to access the services and benefits and infrastructure and spaces of a city should just be derived from our inhabitation of it and not from whether or not we can actually pay for it. So that's, in some ways that's a pretty challenging stance to take. That's because it does run counter to how we're used to doing things and how we're used to thinking about access to the city and access to urban spaces. It's
kind of mind-blowing in its scale, but there's a genuine comfort in the idea of it that people are equal in a country. We talk about equality from a number of different perspectives. You know, everyone has the right to vote, democracy, etc., etc. But it sort of doesn't apply when you marry these things up with the way we approach economics. But we all live in cities. Why shouldn't we share equally?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've talked a lot about access, but something we talk about a lot in Right to the City movements is also this idea of appropriation, which is that not only should we all have the right to be able to access the city, but we should all have the right to help produce the city as well. And if the spaces and services of a city aren't working for us, we should actually have the capacity to reproduce them in a way that is more equitable, that's more effective, and that works better for the people who need to access that service. And currently, so this really challenges ideas about who has the right to get involved in producing cities and also how we produce cities.
Fascinating. Dr. Natalie Osborne, Tony Matthews alongside her. Tony, you had a bit of experience with this working in Ireland, I believe.
I did, yeah, Matt. I used to live in a real jewel of an area, a very run-down area, but a wonderful place to live. It was an inner-city suburb in Cork in Ireland, where I'm originally from. It was a place called Shandon, a really, really important area culturally and historically, but had fallen into decline and disrepair over a number of decades, and there was no real coherence around how the place was being managed or how its advantage or fundamentals could be maximised. And council had more or less divested themselves of responsibility, not directly, they just sort of stopped paying attention. And when I was living there was a group formed called the Shandon Area Renewal Association, and basically the ethos was, look, nobody's going to do this for us, we're going to have to do it for ourselves. So a number of us got together, put our heads together, sort of organised ourselves and started looking at how can we improve, how can we maximise, how can we generate better return from this space, how can we make it a better space, a more inclusive space, a more active space, a safer space with less crime, somewhere that people want to come and visit and maybe ultimately want to come and live in. And we got to looking at that, and we started targeting everything from the very, very fine grain, the kind of broken window theory. You see a piece of graffiti, you see a broken window, you chase up the building owner and get something done about it, right up to using the whole district as a performance space for a major Halloween spectacle that's now annual, probably one of the best Halloween parades in Europe, called the Dragon of Shandon. There's 5 or 6 outdoor festivals every year in Shandon. We got the area certified as an architectural conservation area, which protects its built environment and makes sure that its buildings and streetscapes aren't unduly interfered with, or anything that's taken out has to be put back properly. So like for like, if limestone cobble comes up, limestone cobble has to go back down, etc., etc. And really the driving force of the Shandon Area Renewal Association was and is Pester Power. It's community-based organisation and Pester Power.
I'm going to get some T-shirts made. Tony Matthews. Interesting too, because it's in a sense taking the city to the places that deserve their slice. Does that make sense?
It does, I think, yeah, because, look, cities are full of wonderful spaces that can be real assets if they're realised and utilised properly. And sometimes it takes a vision, and this is the kind of work that I did back then and that Natalie's doing now. And because, that vision doesn't necessarily or can't necessarily come from council or from urban planners or policymakers or whatever. It's not that they're not interested in having that vision. They just maybe don't have the capacity or don't have the resources. They have too many competing demands on them. And so sometimes it's residents and community members themselves who have to really create that pressure and that context and that demand. I remember, as an example, sitting down with the City Heritage Officer when we were looking to get Shandon made into an architectural conservation area, and there were several parts of the city that were going forward for ACA status at the time, and he said to me, you guys are going to get it because you're making the most noise. And there's other places that deserve it, but they're not making enough noise, so they're going to have to wait till the next round. But you guys won't leave us alone if we don't give it to you. So as long as we can say that there's a basis for it, we'll give it to you.
Pester Power.
Absolutely.
Good on you guys. Fascinating as always. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers. Dr. Tony Matthews, Dr. Natalie Osborne, both urban planners, getting a bit philosophical today. They're from the School of Environment at Griffith University. Inequality in the city.